There's a story told of two monks. One was older, the other was younger, and both of them were asked by the Father Abbot if they would go on a mission. It would take them 3 or 4 days away from the monastery, and they would have to journey throughout these days. Both of them agreed to the mission that they were asked, and so the following morning the two monks got up early, and they began to set off on their journey. As they left the monastery and traveled, they began talking with one another, singing and praying together. And 3 or 4 hours into the journey, they reached a place where there was a river. The river was deep and the current was fast. They would have to wade through to get to the other side so that they could continue on their journey. As they were about to enter into the river, a woman came up to them and said, "Thank goodness you're here. Would you help me to cut across the river? I'm afraid that it is too deep for me. The current is too strong. I might fall and I will drown." At first, the older monk pretended that he didn't see or hear the woman, hoping that she would simply go away. But as she persisted, the older monk finally looked at her and said, "No, we cannot help you. We are monks." And so he began himself to cross the water. Immediately, the younger monk picked up the woman, drew her close to him, entered into the water, and waded across to the other side. And then he placed her down on the ground. The woman thanked him profusely. She went off in one direction, and the two monks went off in the other to continue on their mission. But as they continued on, the older monk became quieter and less talkative to the younger monk. And finally, where they reached the place where they would stay for the night, they gathered around a fire to warm themselves up. And finally, the older monk said something to the younger monk. He said, "I cannot believe what you did at the riverbank. How is it that you could have picked up that woman? How is it that you could have drawn her so close to yourself? What will Father Abbot think? What will the other monks think? What will people begin to think about you? You did wrong in helping her at that moment." The younger monk simply shook his head and said, "Brother, I am not the one who did something wrong. It is you that did something wrong." The older monk was startled and surprised at what the younger monk had said to him. "How is it that I did something wrong? I followed all of the rules that apply to us. I am the one that is right. You are the one that is wrong." But the younger monk looked at him and said, "The problem is, yes, I picked up the woman. I held her close to me and brought her to the other side so that she could be safe, doing what was right and just, what was compassionate and needed. But when I placed her down at the riverbank, I let her go. The problem with you, my dear brother, is that you have continued to keep her in your heart. And because of that, you are filled with the spirit of lust. You are filled with the spirit of anger. You are filled with the spirit of righteousness. You are unable to let her go. You are unable to do what was required of us in mercy, in compassion, and in justice." The young monk had taught the older monk what it truly meant to be a witness of Jesus, and how one must not just live the letter of the law, but moreover to live the spirit of the law, if one wanted to truly be a disciple of Jesus. I think in many ways this tension between the younger monk and the older monk in the story help us to be able to enter into the spirit of our gospel that we have just heard proclaimed tonight. Over these past few weeks, we have entered into this chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, known as the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is gathering with large groups of people that are interested in being his disciples and following in his footsteps. And so Jesus has been teaching them what is required to be able to be his disciple and how it is that they are to live their lives. And in many ways, in this particular part of St. Matthew's Gospel, we hear Jesus being like the younger monk, and we hear the scribes and the Pharisees, the leading officials, being like the older monk. Jesus himself was like the younger monk because he understood that to be able to be faithful to the will of his Father, to do his Father's will, he needed not only to live the letter of the law of the Old Testament, but more importantly, he needed to live the spirit of the law. And therefore, Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And fulfilling the law meant more than just seeing the letter that was there, but being able to live the spirit. And as Jesus lived both the letter and the spirit of the law, he lived with a sense of integrity of heart. He lived with a sense of authenticity. And because of this integrity and authenticity, Jesus became attracted to other people then, because so often they had been let down by the religious and political leaders of their day, who said one thing but did another. But here with Jesus, what he said, he lived. What he preached, he embraced in his life. And so there was an integrity, an authenticity that was there. And this became attractive to the people of Jesus' day. And because of that attractiveness, they desired to want to embrace it in their lives, in spite of the fact that many of the things that Jesus spoke about were challenging and demanding. But because they saw Jesus and his disciples living that demanding gospel, they were willing to embrace it themselves. And so, like the younger monk, they were willing to live not only the letter, but the spirit of the law. But unlike Jesus, we hear the attitude of the scribes and the Pharisees in our gospel. They were the leading religious officials of the day. They knew the law and the prophet of the Old Testament inside out and upside down. They were great at telling other people how it is that they should live their lives. But somehow when it came to them, they were always able to find a loophole that exempted them from the high standard of living the law and the prophets. And so instead of living the spirit of the law, the scribes and the Pharisees simply lived the letter of the law and found loopholes to exempt them from doing the good that they were called to do. And so in many ways, the scribes and the Pharisees were like that older monk who lived simply the letter of the law, who closed themselves to mercy, to compassion, to generosity, to faithfulness to others. And as a result of that, the people did not then listen to the example of the scribes and the Pharisees because they lacked that sense of integrity and authenticity. And so the challenge that Jesus presents in the gospel to his followers then and to us tonight is whether or not we are simply going to live our lives by the letter of the law, or are we going to live by the spirit of the law? Are we going to live like Jesus and the younger monk, or are we going to live like the scribes and the Pharisees and the older monk? This is the great challenge and invitation. And so we must make a choice, as our first reading from the book of Sirach reminds us. If you choose, you can follow the commandments. If you choose, you can follow life or death. You can follow the pathway of the world or the pathway of God. But we do have to make a choice. And the choices that we make will have consequences, not only here and now, but more so in the world to come. And therefore we must use the time and the talent and the treasure that God has given to us in the here and now to be able to choose to be like Jesus, to be able to choose to be able to live not only the letter, but the spirit of the law. And so how is it that we go about doing this in practical day-to-day life? I think first and foremost, for us to be authentic and integral disciples of Jesus, we need to be able to pray for the courage to not only know the truth of God, but to be able to accept that truth in our lives. Because if we are honest with ourselves, we can easily become like the scribes and the Pharisees. We can try to find loopholes not to accept the fullness of God's truth, not to accept the teachings of the church, not to live by the commandments. We can begin to play games in our minds. Well, did God really mean that I couldn't do this? Did God really mean that I can't do that? We can begin to play games with ourselves and saying, well, at least I'm not as bad as my brother-in-law, or my neighbor. I'm only doing this, but look at the way the others live. And we can begin to rationalize, well, God really wants me to be happy, and if this is going to make me happy, isn't that what God would want? And so first and foremost, to live with authenticity and integrity in our lives, we need to be able to know and to embrace the truth of God's ways and God's love and God's law, and to be able not to play these games, but to be able to live in that spirit of surrender, of receptiveness, and of openness to what God is asking of us. The second way that we are called then to live these lives of integrity is that as we embrace the truth of God and accept it in our lives, then we recognize that there are moments when we must say no. We must say no to sin in our lives. We must say no to the temptations that lead to sin. We must say no sometimes to people and situations that we know that are not healthy or holy in our lives. And so we need to have that courage to be able to say no to those things that are unholy and unhealthy in our lives. And when we do this, it leads to a spirit of freedom. It leads to a spirit of peace. It leads to a spirit of fulfillment. And so we must pray for that courage to be able to say no to those things that are unhealthy. And the reason that we say no to those things that are unhealthy is so that we can say yes to those things of God that are healthy and holy in our lives. And then finally, the third way in which we are called to embrace these lives of integrity and authenticity is not only to embrace the truth, not only to say no to those things that are unhealthy or unholy, but then it is to say yes to those things that God asks us, to be able to do the good that we are called to do, like the younger monk in the story, and to be able to do so in the spirit of Jesus, with freedom, with joy, with compassion, with mercy. And so we must do the good that God calls us to do as we live the spirit of the law. And so as we gather to celebrate our Eucharist this evening, as we continue to journey with Jesus and the disciples through these great teachings on the Sermon on the Mount, we are called to have that openness and receptivity, to allow the truth and the ways and the laws of God to penetrate into the depths of our heart and our being, so that we can become more and more authentic disciples of Jesus, that we can continue to build his kingdom in the here and now. And as our psalmist reminds us, those that follow the ways of the Lord experience a blessedness in their lives.